If we think about what a deepfake is, it's a digitally manipulated photo or video purporting to show someone or something doing something they've not said or done. That is not something that's actually unique to AI.
How do you allow innovation to flourish without stifling democracy?
That's the question that we all wrestle with in terms of policy and tech change. In election law and generally, I think we have a fairly clear set of principles. We think people should say things that are true. You don't say things that are deliberately misleading and falsely impersonating another candidate. If you are involved in a campaign, involved in public dialogue, that carries responsibilities as well as rights. I don't think there's anything wrong with those. I think they just need to be put into practice for online dialogue.
Frances, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This Zinoviev Letter was a political deepfake back in 1924. Why has it taken 100 years for us to start taking action on these things?
So you have put your finger on the really interesting thing about deepfakes, which is that for as long as there have been elections, unscrupulous people have tried to tell lies and unscrupulous people have attempted to mislead the public. If we think about what a deepfake is, it's a digitally manipulated photo or video purporting to show someone or something doing something they've not said or done. That is not something that's actually unique to AI. We discussed the Zinoviev Letter was effectively a fake letter from a Soviet leader that was allegedly inciting the British Communist Party to revolution. It turned out to be a fake, but not after it had been published in the papers a couple of days before, I think, the then general election. The left-wing party then did badly, and then it turned out that the letter itself was not true. But elections are fairly difficult to avoid. And actually, if something influences the result of an election and the election takes place, that's it. So with deepfakes, there's nothing fundamentally new about the principle of unscrupulous people trying to mislead. But what's changed is how easy it is. Say 50, 100 years ago, making a lifelike representation of someone was really, really difficult. And now anyone with AI can do it.
So you've just published a report and it really addresses many of these concerns. Just give me the outline of the report.
So the report looks at deepfakes in the context of UK election law. UK election law is quite specific. It's a subset of laws looking to regulate the conduct of elections. UK election law is also very old. A lot of it comes from the 19th century, but all the principles that we've got hold true for deepfakes, hold true regardless. But the problem is the wording of the law and the ability to enforce it isn't up to speed with deepfakes. And now, as we see deepfakes coming into society, we're seeing four main misuses of them. There's intimate image abuse, there's fraud, there's election misinformation, and then there's a new fourth category, which is monetising somebody's face or voice, for example, a celebrity, where their face or voice has monetary cachet. And at the moment, the law has never had to deal with something like this. And so the law is taking some time to come up to speed with how you would regulate these things and how you would also then enforce it.
So at the moment, police generally say no crime's been committed.
Yes. And we've seen this before with intimate image abuse in that a couple of years ago, shockingly, it was perfectly legal to create a fake intimate image of someone, just as it was legal to share non-consensual intimate images. But because, again, prior to technology, there wasn't really a reason for the law to cover something that you and I and everyone listening to this would agree is wrong on principle, but it wasn't written into legislation. That has now been updated. It now is illegal. And currently, election deepfakes, so showing a politician or a political figure saying something that person would not say or do, it's on the whole not covered by existing areas of legislation. There are other laws you could use for it, but you'd be getting someone on a byproduct of something else, of slander or libel, in some cases data protection. But there isn't a single reason in election law why someone could make a fake of a prime minister fake the Prime Minister saying something and circulating it before polling day.
You make the distinction between deep fakes that harm people, but also deep fakes that can help them. Just tell me a little bit more about that.
This is where it gets really, really interesting, and where I'm sitting here as a tech optimist, because we do see benevolent use cases of deepfakes, people using them to communicate with voters from prison, people using them to communicate with voters when they're ill. In some cases, and this gets interesting and ambiguous, the person is on their deathbed or the person is dead. I don't know where the ethical line there is, but it's a really, really interesting one. What we're seeing, I think, in politics and also in general, is there's always a modal shift as technology comes and changes the way people communicate. It happened when you had the advent of broadcasting. You went from politicians on the stump persuading people locally, standing in marketplaces, and then suddenly everyone's listening on the radio or they're watching on TV. Then you had the modal shift to the internet, and then as well as watching on TV and as well as listening to broadcast on TV or radio, then people are looking, discussing online, and that changed everything in the way people communicated. It took us until 2022 in the UK to start thinking about regulating online campaigning in the same way as print. There was nothing wrong with the principles we had, but the principles didn't cover online campaigning in the same way as pushing a leaflet through a door. And now we've got deepfakes, the idea that a politician could make a telephone call to someone using their voice. Is that different to writing someone a letter with a printed signature? I don't know. It's a really interesting question. But where there is a clear ethical line is deepfake is using digital to communicate and using digital to mislead.
So, what are your recommendations? How can we stop this?
There are a couple of things we can do. I'm not going to say any of this is simple, but there are a couple of things we can do. Broadly, you can split the challenge of deepfakes in elections into two different categories. You've got the legal category. So if someone does something like this and it's misleading, what laws are they broken? And then you've got enforcement. How do we enforce it? Even if it's wrong, how do we catch and find and stop the perpetrator before polling day? In the legal category, if you look at election law, old as it is, actually that history it has is an advantage. If you look at the principles there, the principles around something called the imprint, which is that any item of material should say who it's for, who it's promoting, and how to contact the person. That is a principle that stands for deepfakes. If you look at a principle, so we've got a concept in election law called false statements, about it being illegal to make a false statement about a candidate during election time. That principle would stand for deepfakes. We've got a principle called agency. This gets really, really nuanced. The idea of agency is that anyone campaigning on behalf of a candidate is part of that candidate's campaign and therefore legally responsible. That one is the one that's most tough to bring up to speed with the nature of modern campaigning, but the principle still is there. But all of those things just need to be legally adapted to online campaigning as well as print. And the imprint is a classic one. If I put out a leaflet through a door, legally it should have an imprint. It took until 2022 for a post on Facebook or a website to legally require to have an imprint. In that time, in the run-up to it, you had a lot of different and disreputable things, including things like false flag campaigning, which is where, say, for example, I'm supporting one candidate, but actually what I really want to do in a first past the post system is split my opponent's vote. So therefore I set up a website or I set up an ad campaign supporting a completely different candidate. But what that different candidate is going to do for me is take away votes from my opponent. So as I bank my vote in, I'm going to be advantaged by that. The imprint prevents you doing that using paper leaflets. Up until 2022, there was nothing to prevent you doing that online. People did. And even now, I don't think the law as it stands is really sufficient to cover what people can do.
You also proposed something about the right to likeness. What is that?
This is a very, very tentative idea. At the moment, we don't have a concept in law of a right to identity, a right to a face, a right to a voice, a right to a personality. If, hypothetically, someone has legal rights to, for example, letters that I've sent them, there is absolutely nothing legally to prevent them creating an avatar of me. You see, and again, interesting, you see something called grief tech, which is a nascent exploration of people taking, for example, letters and photos of a loved one and turning that into an avatar that can talk back to them. That's really complicated ethically and in terms of what implications that could have. Personally, I think it's a terrible idea. Some people clearly think it's a good one. But there's nothing to stop you doing that to a living person, provided you own the copyright. How you would get that into law and what tensions you would have is a really, really complicated question. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sitting here saying I know the answer. But if you look at the progress of technology, we've always had to adapt the law to keep fundamental principles. A really good example is when the invention of print came in. That was the thing that later led to copyright. There was no need to have a concept of copyright, of intellectual ownership over your creation, until you had the ability for mass replication. Because before that, well, it didn't really matter. The ability to make use of someone else's creation wasn't really physically possible. And the same thing is arguably true of the concept of right to a likeness. It wasn't possible to plausibly or easily create replicas or impersonate someone. It is now. We might need to bring the law up to speed.
So if the laws are changed, is there a danger that it could stifle, for instance, satire or freedom of speech?
Satire, to give this a really quick answer, no. The reason is I will die on the hill on defending the right to satire. I think the laws in this country are actually pretty weak in terms of protecting satirists. They should be much stronger. But for satire, you don't need a lifelike representation of someone. If you look at any satire, whether it's a cartoon, the Spitting Image, Saturday Night Live, it's an exaggerated representation. You absolutely should have the right to represent politicians and public figures and satire them. Do you need a misleading image? Absolutely not. In terms of freedom of speech, it gets interesting and it gets difficult because the law has a clear answer again in terms of print. Say, 50 years ago, if I was having a conversation with my friends in the pub, in theory, bits of election law might cover me. In theory, libel and slander, but actually in practice, your friends in the pub, it's fine. If I were to go and print something on a leaflet, post it through all the doors in my street, everyone would agree that's covered by election law, that's campaigning. If I were to write a letter to the local newspaper, there's an ethical code of practice and there are regulations that cover the newspaper. It has a code of conduct, it has a regulator. If instead of talking to my friends in the pub, I'm posting on Facebook to a close circle of friends, the law at the moment doesn't really know where that falls. If instead of a close circle of friends on Facebook, I'm posting on a Twitter account and I've got 100,000 followers and 100 people are going to repeat what I say, is that different from the conversation on Facebook? Again, outside of libel and slander, the law doesn't really know where that falls.
AI obviously has huge economic potential, but I guess this is a different part of the same question. How do you allow innovation to flourish without stifling democracy?
I would absolutely love to be able to give a really simple answer to that in 30 seconds, and I'd probably be very wealthy. That's the question that we all wrestle with in terms of policy and tech change. What I would say is, going back to that point on principles-based regulation, in election law and generally, I think we have a fairly clear set of principles. We think people should say things that are true. You don't say things that are deliberately misleading, particularly if it's deliberately misleading and falsely impersonating another candidate. Those principles we spoke about earlier, about the imprint, which is the underlying principle of items of campaigning material should say who they're from and why. Items about false statements. Items about agency, that people are, if you are involved in a campaign, involved in public dialogue, that carries responsibilities as well as rights. I don't think there's anything wrong with those. I think they just need to be put into practice for online dialogue. And again, going back to that point, if what we are seeing is a modal shift, there's a lot here that's really, really exciting in terms of how people can communicate. But we all know and are aware that regulation exists to allow technological change to happen safely.
How responsible are we as individuals, and what should we be looking for in order not to spread false information and not to believe it, not to be taken in by it?
I personally would be really sceptical of anything I saw online that I couldn't verify. But again, I would say I'm fairly cynical, but there have absolutely been misleading things online that, until I looked into them, had me. And I suspect with deepfakes, as in specifically misleading representations of people, we're at the dangerous in-between space now, where making lifelike fakes is possible, and also that people believe what they say online. I'm really worried about the next couple of years, but actually I think after the next couple of years, people will probably have simply adapted to just treat any video they see with the same scepticism as they'd see an unverified bit of text. But we are part of that modal shift now, where we're still treating what we see online similar to what we see in print in an environment that isn't regulated.
You write that the fear we experienced in 2024 didn't really materialise, but can we conquer it now? Are we already behind the curve, or is there a way back?
It's been a very interesting last couple of weeks, and this is just things that have crossed my timeline. A good response from Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, to deepfakes of her. Deepfake of a BBC newsreader circulating. That wasn't a deepfake to discredit her. They were using her authority, using the fact that she was a BBC newsreader to say this thing that the avatar was saying was, I forget the details, but using her authority. And then I think there was a quite funny one of Emily Thornberry and the Select Committee, which Emily Thornberry, I think herself repeated and found funny, thought was satire. What we've also seen in the last few weeks, and in the report I am a massive sceptic of the Electoral Commission and their ability to deal with more or less anything, but what the Electoral Commission have done, and fair play to them, is in the last couple of weeks they've announced a deepfake detection pilot where they'll report back after the local elections, and that's a really positive step.
Frances, thank you.
Thank you.